My name is Daniel Cervan-Gil, and I'm manager of programs at the Global Center for Pluralism. I'm delighted to be joined by David Lubell, founding director of Welcoming International, an initiative that partners with entities across the world to build bottom-up movements for migrants and refugee welcoming in their countries. This interview is part of the Center's Pluralism and the Pandemic online portal, a curated collection of writing, interviews, and videos exploring responses to the pandemic around the world from many fields of practice. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Great to see you, Daniel.
It's a pleasure to see you too. My first question for you would be, as we know, cities and municipalities are at the forefront of inclusion. But what are the lessons that cities are learning during the COVID pandemic?
Sure. So yeah, it's been a lot because cities are at the forefront and they're doing a lot and trying to figure out what it is that they're doing while they do it. But something as we've tried to make some sort of sense together, because we work with a lot of cities around the world, we started to see things kind of fade into or go into about three categories. So it all, from our perspective, we work on inclusion. So it's about inclusion for us and for the cities we work with, but it's a different kind of inclusion. So first of all, we weren't doing as much around inclusive emergency response, but obviously due to COVID-19, there's now a lot being done around, all right, now we have to focus more on emergency response, but how do we do that in an inclusive way? And so that's one of the three kind of buckets of work. And one lesson is just, focus on emergency response, but do it in a way that addresses all of the different barriers that immigrants, refugees, and other marginalized people might face when it comes to a pandemic. And there's been a lot of sharing of ideas and a lot of innovation happening in that area. The second area is around recovery. And most places are not in that stage yet. It's still really the emergency response stage, but there are some that now at least have enough breathing room to start thinking about, okay, how do we start thinking about recovery, whether it's health recovery, whether it's economic recovery. The key is to figure out how to start to plan now for recovery where no one's left behind, recovery that is inclusive and just. And so that is another area of work. And the final is inclusive narrative. Narrative has always been an extremely important part of the work that we do and that the communities that we work with do. But right now it's especially important. There is, there's been backlash or fears being elevated about immigrants due to the pandemic and different conspiracy theories or fears of specific groups. Originally from China, for example, there's fear in some communities of Asians, but now that can be spread to fear of all sorts of different groups, including anyone who looks different. And so inclusive narrative, getting the messages out about positive contributions of all members of the community, including immigrants and refugees. It's not just a matter of something nice, it's actually essential right now to ensure that things go smoothly and that the recovery, again, we need to build the will for an inclusive recovery, and the narrative is essential for building that will. So yeah, those are the three buckets that we're looking at and our members are looking at.
Great. And from all those, from among those three buckets, what are some of the policy responses at the city level that you think are particularly worthy of being highlighted?
Sure. So I would say, when it comes to the emergency response piece that we talked about, there's been, again, a lot of innovation. I would say there's the cities that have been most successful in this and the communities that have been most successful are the ones that have recognized that government can't do this by themselves. And there's a lot, in any community, there's a lot of almost any community, there are NGOs that work with immigrants and refugees, or if not NGOs, there's faith organizations, there's groups that have the trust of immigrant and refugee communities and understand the barriers that they face every day. And those barriers are just elevated right now. And trust is harder to come by right now. And so working harder and more in close collaboration with NGOs that work with immigrants or other marginalized groups is key. And the city of Charlotte in the United States has done a really good job of this, because they've just worked with the NGO community for so closely for so long, and have built a lot of trust. But yeah, there's a lot of examples of that. But that's I think a take-home idea, that don't try to do it by yourself if you're government. When it comes to inclusive recovery, these plans and this work is still at the initial stage. Because yeah, how do you really advance the recovery planning work when you're still in emergency? But there are some efforts that are taking place that we've been impressed with. In Australia, for example, the Welcoming Australia, who is we have national members that then facilitate networks. And Welcoming America is one of those members, but Welcoming also is the lead organization for Welcoming International. But Welcoming Australia leads this initiative, is leading an initiative called No One Left Behind. And they're really trying to do work in trying to say, okay, what can cities do when we really create this frame? And this frame is useful now. How do we make sure no one gets left behind in the emergency? What are the policies that need to take place? What are the things that different levels of government includes a petition campaign for the national government, because it's not, this isn't something that just local government can do. But that No One Left Behind frame and the sort of efforts and policies will also be integrated into the recovery planning stage. And so yeah, again, there'll be advocacy on all 3 levels of government, provincial, local, and national. But also, again, how do we make sure when we're doing recovery planning later that planning really is going to leave no one behind? Because if anyone's left behind, that's going to affect the prosperity and the health of everyone. And then finally, on the inclusive narrative piece, one thing, and you alluded to it, Daniel, there is right now this moment, we're still in this moment of increased solidarity. It's kind of strange because we're both in a moment of increased fear of the other and increased solidarity at the same time. But that's just where we are as a global community, because this is happening all over the world. But within all of that, there is this opportunity that, if people are feeling this sense of solidarity, particularly because of the idea that frontline workers, including a lot of diverse frontline workers, there's immigrants, people of color, disproportionately represent emergency and frontline workers in most countries in the world, and so this idea of highlighting the contributions of those who are on the front line, not just immigrants and refugees, but everyone, is really important. And we're actually on the global level working with an organization called More in Common that does great work on sort of analyzing public opinion. We're also working with the Mayor's Migration Council, which brings a great depth of mayors from not just our network, but from countries all over the world, to think about how you can provide tools for cities to take advantage of this moment of solidarity and advance it and keep it moving forward, so you can actually start to put in some policies and some infrastructure that can keep that really turn solidarity into the types of policies that you want to see for a new beginning. As far as communications campaigns, those are all getting off the ground also. One example, again in Australia, is this campaign called Be Kind Ballarat. And Ballarat is a city in Australia. There's another city that's replicated this work, but if you Google that, you'll find some of the communications work that they're doing. But it's really well done, and it does. If you watch it, it creates that sense of solidarity. I'm not from there, but I still feel sort of a common bond to other members of that town and city just by watching what they've done. So they've done a good job. And so we're looking at that innovation. We're looking at all these innovations and thinking about how to scale those throughout our network and beyond, which is exciting. I mean, it's both a time of a lot of fear, but also a time of possibility, and we want to seize the moment, but also be aware of the dangers of the moment, again, at the same time.
Mm-hmm. It is inspiring actually to see that there are so many good initiatives from all over the world, and thank you for sharing a few examples of that. I want to turn into the risks. As you say, there's a lot of possibility. There's also a lot of fear and risk. My next question would be, in your opinion, what are the biggest threats to social cohesion in the now during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic world?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, yes, we're in a world of extraordinary opportunity and risk, and we want to be able to, again, seize opportunities and mitigate risk. I would say, yeah, I mean, the biggest risks are, really, honestly, political. When politicians, there will be both politicians and movements, particularly on the, frankly, on the far right, that are going to try to tie the idea of immigrants or foreigners or people who look different than the mainstream and or the majority population, quote unquote, whatever that means, tie that community in narrative with the pandemic in some way. And when the borders start to open up again in places, that's when those forces will likely start to get more aggressive with that types of messaging and those types of narratives. And so, yeah, I think the biggest threats are narrative threats, because if narrative affects people's perceptions and beliefs, then it's going to affect their political behavior, who they vote for. It's going to affect how they, interact with their neighbors. It's going to affect policies on local, state, and national level. And so, the narrative threat is the threat that needs to really be addressed the most. And so, this work that we're talking about around inclusive narrative, again, it's not just an optional thing. It's essential right now if we want to prevent, if we want to mitigate those threats. And there are opportunities, but we need to play offense, frankly.
In a way, you're answering my last question, but what do we need to ensure that gets done now so that we get out of this pandemic with a more equitable, a more resilient and inclusive world?
Yeah, I mean, the inclusive narrative and inclusive recovery pieces are essential. And so, yeah, the narrative is creating the will for reimagining what a community or a country could be. And so the narrative piece is how you create that will. And so that if we want to come out of this with more resilient, more inclusive communities, we need to focus on the narrative. And there's so much good out there right now, so many contributions that people are making. That there's a lot of positive opportunities to educate people about contributions that people were already making, but it's finally starting to break through. And so, yeah, we need to do that. We need to, put a foot on the gas on that. But then when it comes to this piece around inclusive recovery, we need to, not just cities, when they're starting to rebuild, like their gut instinct, and there will be pressure on them to just move quickly and work on rebuilding, but they need to do the rebuilding and the planning around recovery in an inclusive way. So they need to bring people from all of the different sectors of communities, and this can also happen on the state or national level. It doesn't, but our focus is on the local level. On the local level, yeah, when it comes to recovery, you got to bring everybody around the table. Maybe it's a virtual table, depending on where things are. But making sure you can, and if it's a virtual table, you got to be inclusive in your practices to make sure that people who don't have as many technological tools at their disposal are able to receive those tools. And we have examples of cities that are figuring out ways to do that. That's another episode, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's about the process. Like when you're thinking about recovery, when you're moving towards recovery, you could do it sort of reflexively, or do it fast because you want to do it fast. And we want to do it fast, but if you want to do it inclusively, you got to bring the immigrant and refugee community to the table. You got to bring, the other minority groups to the table. You have to bring the business community to the table so that everybody can talk about, all right, this is this is how we can reimagine this new community together. This is an opportunity to reimagine, you know, what's education going to look like in our community in the future? What's, you know, how can we change the way services are delivered in the future, et cetera, et cetera. But it's about the process, and we need to respect everyone's voice. And communities are a great place to do that because everybody's there, and you can actually have representation. And so that's key.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, David, for joining me today. And for those watching online, if you're interested in more content like this, please check out our Pluralism in the Pandemic portal by following the link at the end of this video. Thank you. Have a good day.